The number is 39%. That is the percentage of Americans who currently identify as Republican or Republican-leaning independents in the first quarter of 2026, according to the latest Gallup tracking data. It is the lowest number Gallup has recorded since 2015, and it lands at the same moment that more than 8 million Americans flooded the streets at over 3,300 No Kings protests in all 50 states. On the same weekend that a Democratic first-time candidate flipped the Florida House district that contains Mar-a-Lago. On the same week that Trump's approval rating hit 36%, the lowest of his return to the White House. Any one of those data points would be notable. All of them happening simultaneously is a structural signal. It points towards something deeper than a bad news cycle for the Republican Party. It points toward an emerging realignment. And the question that everyone who cares about how political power actually works needs to be asking right now is whether this is a temporary fluctuation or the beginning of a sustained shift. To answer that, you have to go past the headlines and into the structure of the data. Start with Gallup's party identification numbers because they are more important than approval ratings and less covered by mainstream outlets. Approval ratings measure how people feel about a specific person on a specific day. Party identification measures how people understand their fundamental political identity. It is sticky, it changes slowly, and when it moves fast, it means something. In the fourth quarter of 2024, Republicans held a 4-point advantage in party identification. In the first quarter of 2025, that advantage had disappeared and the parties were tied. By the second quarter of 2025, Democrats had taken a 3-point lead. By Q3, it was 7. By Q4, it was 8. And now in Q1 of 2026, it has reached 10 points. 49% Democrat or Democratic leaning to 39% Republican or Republican leaning. That is a 14-point swing in 12 months. To find a comparable shift this fast, you have to go back to the early months of Barack Obama's first term in 2009, when Democrats briefly held similar advantages before the Tea Party movement organized and flipped it back by 2010. Or you have to go back to the months following George W. Bush's second term, when the Iraq War, Katrina, and the financial crisis had dragged Republican identity numbers to historic lows. Here is what makes the current shift analytically interesting and not just politically convenient for one team. The Gallup data shows that the movement is not coming primarily from people who already identified as Democrats getting more enthusiastic. It is coming from independents who are moving toward the Democratic column. Among independents, Democratic leaners now outnumber Republican leaners 20 to 15%, 3 points more Democratic leaning than in 2024. And independents, at 45% of the electorate, a record high, are the largest single group of voters. When they shift, the whole map shifts. Gallup's own analysis notes the cause. Negative evaluations of the sitting president and his party's governance, primarily felt by political independents who have weaker long-term partisan attachments, cause exactly this kind of movement. It happened under Biden. It happened under Obama. It happened under Bush. It is a pattern. The question is not whether it happens. The question is how severe it gets and whether it crystallizes in time for the next election cycle. All of the conditions for crystallization are present. Gallup's own analysis of comparable periods shows that the current scale of the shift, when combined with sustained negative economic conditions, tends to persist and deepen rather than reverse in the short term. And the economic conditions that are driving it: oil prices 77% above pre-war levels, gas over $4 nationally, grocery inflation feeding through the supply chain, Federal Reserve constrained from cutting rates by energy-driven inflation, are not going to resolve quickly. That brings us to where this structural shift is visible most clearly right now: Wisconsin. Wisconsin is not just a swing state, it is a political laboratory. It has produced two of the three most expensive state Supreme Court elections in American history in back-to-back years. It was the state where Elon Musk personally spent enormous sums trying to win the 2025 judicial race for Brad Schimmel and lost badly to now Justice Susan Crawford. It is the state where April 7th, 2026, is producing another Supreme Court election, this time between Chris Taylor on the progressive side and Maria Lazar on the conservative side, for the seat being vacated by conservative Justice Rebecca Bradley, who chose not to seek re-election. Here is why this race matters structurally, beyond Wisconsin's borders, and even beyond this single seat. The Wisconsin Supreme Court currently holds a 4-3 liberal majority. That majority has been the primary institutional check on federal overreach into Wisconsin state affairs. The federal government is currently suing Wisconsin to obtain private voter data. Redistricting cases that will determine legislative maps through the next decade are winding through the courts. Reproductive rights cases are in the pipeline. And the independence of state judiciaries as a counterweight to executive branch pressure is being tested in ways that set precedent for every other state. A Taylor win expands the majority to 5-2 and insulates it against the next several elections scheduled for 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030. A Lazar win keeps it at 4-3, meaning that any one of those next four elections could flip control of the entire court. The Marquette University Law School poll from March 11 to 18 shows Taylor leading 30-22 among likely voters, but 46% remain undecided among likely voters. And here is the strategic data point that matters most for predicting the outcome. Democratic voters are 18 points more likely than Republican voters to describe themselves as certain to vote on April 7th. 65% of Democrats say this race is very important to them. 46% of Republicans say the same. That 19-point importance gap is the single strongest predictor of turnout differential, and it currently favors Taylor significantly. But there is a counter-signal that anyone doing honest strategic analysis cannot ignore. Early absentee voting in Wisconsin is running approximately 112,000 ballots behind the 2025 pace. Total spending in this race is under $9 million, compared to over $100 million in 2025. A third of registered voters in the Marquette poll said they have heard nothing about this race. The enthusiasm advantage Taylor holds is real, but enthusiasm that does not translate into actual ballot returns is not an election outcome. It is a polling number. The strategic question for Democrats in Wisconsin specifically is whether the No Kings protest energy of March 28th converts into April 7th turnout. The strategic question for Republicans is whether a lower profile race and lower overall turnout insulates Lazar from the national headwinds Trump's numbers represent. Now, let's zoom out to the national political map and what the combination of all these signals means for November 2026. The structural fundamentals for the midterm elections are aligning in a pattern that is historically familiar and historically significant. When a sitting president is below 40% approval in the second year of his term, His party almost always loses seats. When party identification is moving against the president's party at the scale Gallup is measuring, the wave tends to be larger than average. When special elections are flipping toward the opposition in districts that voted for the president, it confirms the directional trend with actual vote totals rather than survey data. Democrats just flipped the Florida House district that contains Trump's Mar-a-Lago residents. In 2024, Trump won that district. In a special election held weeks ago, a first-time Democratic candidate flipped it. That is not a fluke. Florida is not a swing state. That district is not a swing district. When the opposition party is flipping districts in the president's literal backyard, it reflects a level of enthusiasm and Republican undervote that translates to wave potential at scale. The midterm environment is also being shaped by the composition of who is now identifying as independent. Gallup's 2025 annual data shows that 56% of Gen Z adults identify as independents, up from 47% of millennials at the same age and 40% of Gen X at the same age. This is not a generational preference for the Democratic Party specifically. It is a generational rejection of both parties as permanent institutions. But right now, those independents are leaning Democratic by 20 to 15. If that lean holds through November 2026, it will shape the composition of the House and Senate in ways that define the rest of Trump's term. Here is the complication that strategic analysts on the Democratic side would be foolish to ignore. Gallup's data also shows that the Democratic Party's overall image is at an all-time low in absolute terms, even as people prefer it to the Republican Party. People are not rushing toward Democrats out of enthusiasm. They are fleeing Republicans out of dissatisfaction. That is a fundamentally different dynamic. It is more fragile. It does not automatically convert into down-ballot wins across diverse districts. It requires candidates and organizations that can give people an affirmative reason to show up, not just a reactive reason. The No Kings movement is the clearest example of reactive energy. 8 million people marched against something, against the war in Iran, against rising prices, against immigration enforcement tactics, against what they describe as threats to democratic institutions. That is powerful. But winning elections in competitive districts requires translating that reaction into a positive case for specific candidates who can hold those districts past the initial wave. The 2018 midterms offer both the blueprint and the warning. Democrats flipped 41 House seats and took the majority. But many of those seats were flipped by moderate candidates running in suburban swing districts on bread-and-butter economic and healthcare messages, not by the most progressive voices in the party. The wave was real. The composition of candidates who successfully rode it was strategic. If 2026 is going to produce a similar outcome, the same discipline will be required. There is also a countervailing force that the structural analysis cannot ignore. The Marquette poll found that among Wisconsin Republicans, 78% who describe themselves as MAGA supporters overwhelmingly approve of the Iran war strikes. The dissent is coming from the 22% of Republicans who do not identify with MAGA. That means the Republican coalition is not collapsing uniformly. The base is holding. What is happening is that the persuadable middle, the independents, the soft Republicans, the people who supported Trump in 2024, hoping for economic relief and got a war instead, are moving. Moving is not the same as gone forever. If the economic situation improves, or if the Iran conflict resolves in a way Trump can credibly frame as a win, some of that movement reverses. The Wisconsin Supreme Court race on April 7th is the first real data point beyond polling that will test these structural theories against actual voter behavior. If Taylor wins by a margin that reflects the enthusiasm gap in the Marquette poll, the wave thesis gets a real-world confirmation. If Lazar wins, or if Taylor wins by a margin significantly smaller than the enthusiasm data suggests, it means the gap between enthusiasm and turnout in a low-profile spring election is larger than expected, and the November 2026 projections need to be recalibrated. Watch the turnout numbers, not just the winner. The margin of Taylor's win or loss and the raw vote totals compared to 2025 will tell you more about the November environment than any single poll. Here is the principle that ties all of this together. Electoral realignments do not announce themselves with clean data in real time. They reveal themselves in retrospect through a pattern of data points that, looked at together, pointed in a consistent direction. Right now, the pattern includes a 14-point swing in Gallup party identification over 12 months, a president at 36% approval, a Democratic flip in Trump's home district in Florida, 8 million people in the streets across all 50 states, an 18-point Democratic enthusiasm advantage in Wisconsin's April 7th Supreme Court race, and an opposition party that is out fundraising, out organizing, and out enthusiasm polling the incumbent party across nearly every measurable metric. None of that is proof of a 2026 wave. History has seen similar patterns stall or reverse when economic conditions improved or when opposition energy failed to crystallize into votes. But when you see this many data points pointing in the same direction at the same time, the analytical error is to discount the pattern because it does not yet have a confirmed election outcome behind it. The confirmed outcome is coming. April 7th in Wisconsin is the next chapter. November 2026 is the final answer, at least for this round. The next 72 hours matter more than the next 72 news cycles. Because the data on early voting in Wisconsin is the real-time read on whether the structural enthusiasm is becoming actual ballots. And what those early vote numbers look like by Thursday will tell you more about November than anything said at a press conference. If this structural analysis gave you a different framework for reading what the polls and the protests actually mean, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next data point in this story is not a speech. It is an election result, and it lands Tuesday. Tell us in the comments, do you read the current data as a genuine realignment in progress, or a temporary reaction that fades if conditions change? Both cases are defensible. Make your argument.